I'm going to read first of all in Judges in chapter 6. Judges in chapter 6. I'm glad to be here tonight and appreciate the invitation and count it an honor to be able to speak here in Clementsville. I'm asked to speak on Gideon, and the outline was his circumstances and his call. Well, I'm going to look at two places where we see Gideon. First of all, in chapter 6, and then secondly, in chapter 8. We're going to look at chapter 6 first, and then we'll take the time to read a bit of chapter 8 in a minute. So Judges chapter 6 and verse 1. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them dens, which are in the mountains, and caves, and strongholds. And so it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them. And they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth, till they come unto Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep nor ox nor ass. For they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude, for both they and their camels were without number. And they entered into the land to destroy it. And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. So there we have the circumstances in Israel. Drop down to verse 11. And there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite. And his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all the miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us, and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? And he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewithal shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said unto him, Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. And he said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. Depart not hence, I pray thee, until I come unto thee, and bring forth my present, and set it before thee. And he said, I will tarry until thou come again. And Gideon went in and made ready a kid and unleavened cakes of an ephah of flour, and flesh he put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and he brought it unto him under the oak, and presented it. And the angel of God said unto him, Take the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and lay them upon this rock, and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put forth the end of his staff that was in his hand, and touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes. And there arose up fire out of the rock, and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. Then the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. That's all we're going to read just for the beginning. We're going to read, as I said, in chapter 8 in a few minutes. So we have Gideon. Gideon, the meaning of his name is a feller or a warrior. So I suppose in my experience, a feller is someone who knocks down trees, isn't he? If you fell a tree, you knock it down, don't you? This is what Gideon's name means, feller. He knocks things down. And so when you see, and the next night, with some of the things that Gideon has done, you're going to see there that he knocks things down. He's a warrior. He's a soldier for God, and he's successful. So Here he is, and his name, that's what his name means. And if you take the time to look it up, 39 times in Judges, Gideon appears. Gideon's name appears 39 times. And then it appears again once in Hebrews chapter 11. 39 times in Judges and once in Hebrews chapter 11. And in Hebrews chapter 11, he's in good company, isn't he? He's with Barak. He's with Samson. And he's with Jephthah in Hebrews chapter 11. When we look at what we read together in verses 1 through 6, we really have times of trouble in Israel. There were times of trouble in the nation. The nation was overrun by their enemies. Interesting, isn't it? We've already been hearing in prayer tonight the things and the challenges that we have in assemblies today. We have challenges, don't we? We have some that are leaving. We have some, and there's problems in the assembly. You know, I thought, where I go in Avonport, if everyone's there, there's 9 people. Now, there used to be a big assembly there. Now, it was never really big, but there was over the years, I did a little searching in the 1960s, the early 1960s, when the hall was built down there, and Mr. Crawford, and I don't know who was with them, they were having meetings here. And they would drive down there, and there was no 101 highway at that time. I don't know how long it took them to get to Avonport and work all day and then come back here and preach in the nighttime. So over the years, there have been numbers have come and gone. But I thought 9 believers in an area. Now, if we had gone into an area and saw 9 people saved, what would you say? What would you say? Revival, wouldn't you? I would. If you went into a place and you saw 9 people saved and 9 people that were interested in gathering unto the Lord, you'd say it's a revival. Well, that's what we have in these places. In these places where there's small assemblies, I know we get discouraged. I know we look around and we see, well, it's not too much. But just remember this. It's precious to God. It's precious to God. And this little remnant in Israel was precious to God. And then you say, well, why would the devil ever care about a little handful of believers? I ask myself that question. Why would Satan ever think to attack just a little tiny handful of believers? Do you know why? At least one reason. Because it's precious to God. It is. The gathering of his saints together is precious to God. So, we have times of trouble in the nation. They're overrun by the world. We read together the description. It says they came as grasshoppers for multitude. You couldn't stand against them. Nothing you could do. Well, sometimes that's what we think, isn't it? Nothing we can do. And we throw up our hands and we say, there's nothing we can do. Well, that's not what Gideon did, was it? You see, we have to stop and we have to think, what is God trying to teach us? What can we do? How many times is it that people say, well, you can't do this and you can't do that? I know. But what can we do? What can we do? And so, Gideon, we read it together in verse 11. The angel Lord comes, and what's happening with Gideon? He's threshing wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. He's threshing wheat by the winepress. Now, I've done a little bit of work on a farm, but threshing wheat wasn't one of the jobs I got. I picked a lot of apples, but threshing wheat wasn't one of it. But I can well imagine that it's a dirty job, threshing wheat. Somehow you have to break that outer hull away from it to get the inside kernel, and then you one of the things you do is you winnow the wheat, and all the chaff goes up and blows away. A dirty job, isn't it? Well, I would expect that if you were going to be making wine, well, you wouldn't want to do that. Where you never suspect. He'll never suspect that we would ever thresh wheat by a wine press. And so that's what he does. He says that he's doing it, and he's doing it to hide it from the Midianites. So he does what he can. So that's challenging to me. I challenge the audience today. Are we doing what we can? I know there's lots of things we can't do. The enemy has overrun the land, so to speak. But are we doing what we can? That's what Gideon did. Here he has wheat at the winepress. Now, the first mention of bread, which I want to link with the wheat, the first mention of bread in the scriptures is in Genesis chapter 3. So your mind goes back to Genesis chapter 3. And when the first mention of bread is there, you remember what he says. God says to Adam, "In the sweat of thy face, thou shalt eat bread." So it's linked with man's failure. It's linked with man's sin, isn't it? It's linked with man's departure from God. And so that's the first mention of bread. You probably know what the first mention of wine is. The first mention of wine is in Genesis chapter 9, and it's in connection with Noah. And Noah planted a vineyard, and he made wine. And what happened? He was drunken. So we see again man's failure in self-control in connection with the wine. But I like it when they're both brought together for the first time. When bread and wine are brought together for the first time, it's Melchizedek. It's Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. Here Melchizedek comes and he brings in bread and wine, and Abram is about to be tempted with the offer from the wicked king. And before that offer comes, Melchizedek comes in. Amazing. Have you looked at it? Have you looked at Melchizedek? He's an amazing Bible character. He comes in Genesis chapter 14, and he's there, and he's presented as the priest king. Now that couldn't happen in Israel, could it? The priesthood came from the Levitical tribe. The kings came from the Judah tribe. But here's Melchizedek, and he's the priest king. And he does what he does, and then he departs off the scene in Genesis. Psalm 110, he comes back, doesn't he? He comes back on the scene when the psalmist writes in Psalm 110. Look at this up for yourself. And then we don't hear of him again till when? Hebrews, the book of the Hebrews. And the Hebrew writer, whoever you think he is, the Hebrew writer takes him up and he uses him and he presents him as a lovely picture of the Lord Jesus Christ, of the one who is the priest. You know, with the priesthood, it's Aaronic, isn't it? Not ironic, it's Aaronic. It's Aaron. It's Aaron with the priesthood. And you know why? You know why the high priest was from Aaron? Because Aaron was under the taskmaster in Egypt, wasn't he? Moses didn't know anything about it. Moses didn't know what it was to make the bricks. Moses didn't know what it was to have the lash on his back of the taskmaster as a slave in Egypt. But Aaron did. And so our great high priest, isn't that lovely? Our great high priest, he knows what we're passing through. We were thinking of it just not too long ago in our Bible reading. The Lord Jesus in John chapter 4, you know what it says there? Amazing words. Being wearied with his journey, he sat thus on the well. Now, the other one that we were looking at was what I mentioned in prayer in Mark chapter 4. He's in the boat and he's asleep in the boat. The one who is asleep in the boat, the one who is wearied with his journey, is the one who is holding up all things by the word of his power. Believe that? The one that was sleeping and the one that was weary, by him all things are held together. All things consist. They're all held together by his mighty power. And yet he experienced the human condition in these ways. And so we have Melchizedek. And if with the bread we have the sweat of it with Adam. And if we have Noah, we have the shame of Noah with the wine. We have the bread and wine brought together, and we have the sovereign, Melchizedek, and we have the servant. Here, another thing that we see in chapter 6, and it's a big word, and I heard it many years ago and just puzzled over it, but the word is Christophany. Christophany. It's an Old Testament appearing of Christ. Okay? And there's many in the Old Testament if you take the time to look at it. It just means Christ, Christophany, revealed. That's what that word means. Christ revealed. In Genesis chapter 18, you remember what happened with Abram? He's in the tent door, and the angels come, and it's the Lord, isn't it? If you read down before he's finished, it's the Lord. In Joshua chapter 5, what does Joshua see? He sees the commander of the army, and it's the Lord. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses sees the burning bush. He's told to remove the shoes from off his feet, isn't he? It's holy ground. Who is it? It's the Lord. And again, and there might be some discussion on this one in Daniel chapter 3 with the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire. What does he say? What does the king say? He says he looks in, he sees the fourth man there. And some have said that's a Christophany too. You can have a look and see. And the key, one of the keys with a Christophany, is that the Lord accepts worship. Okay? Angels do not accept worship. Right? You go through the book of the Revelation and you see over and over again, John, he sees an angel, he worships. The angel says, do not worship me. See thou doest it not. Angels do not accept worship, but the Lord accepts worship. And so that's the idea of the Christophany. In verse 15, we saw there Gideon's humility. His humility. You know, if we had to look back, if we had looked at 1 Samuel, we would have come across a man, and his name is Saul, King Saul. Well, there wasn't very much humble about Saul, was there? King Saul. Not very much humble. But here we see Gideon, and he's a humble man. He's marked by humility. He says in verse 15, how shall I say, my family is poor. I'm the least in my father's house. If you want to take the time to look at that little term, the least, you'll find that it's mentioned a few times in scriptures as well. And it's an interesting study. So the least, and he takes and he moves in humility. Then finally, in the last part, he brings a meal, he makes the preparation, and his service, what he did to serve the Lord, was turned into a sacrifice. What he did to serve the Lord and preparing all that meal was turned into a sacrifice. Do we appreciate that today? Do we appreciate the fact that our service to God is a sacrifice? It's a sacrifice. And you remember what the sacrifices, well, especially with the burnt sacrifice, with the burnt offering. There was a sweet savor and it rose to God. Could it be, can we appreciate today that our service for God rises as a sweet savor to him? That the things we do for God, he takes notice of, he appreciates. And so we have these things in verses 19 to 21. His meal is turned into a sacrifice. And so we have adverse conditions prevailing in Israel. Not what we would say perfect conditions for a Christian, if you can allow me to put it that way. But faithfulness, the faithfulness of Gideon, in spite of the adversity. He has humility in his service, and his labor is turned into a sacrifice. We would say here, here's Gideon, and he's all by himself. All by himself, isn't it? It doesn't say anybody else is helping him here. He's all by himself here. But he's in good company when you get to Hebrews chapter 11, isn't he? He's in good company. So even though sometimes we feel that maybe we're all by ourselves, sometimes we feel like nobody knows and nobody understands. Well, just remember, if we're serving the Lord, if we're doing it in accordance with his word, God knows and God takes notice. And so he was by himself at the winepress, but in good company in Hebrews chapter 11. Now I'm going to put you to work again. Philippians chapter 2. Sometimes this helps so that people stay awake. You flip some pages. Philippians chapter 2 for a verse. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not on every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. So I take it Paul's writing here to the Philippians. One of the problems is that they're not like-minded. They're going in different directions. When you get to chapter 4, you're going to see Eodius and Syntyche, and they're at odds with one another. What he says, be like-minded. Be like-minded. And so we have in verse 3, we have esteem other better than themselves. In the next portion, the next passage, we have the example of that with the Lord Jesus. And when you come into verse 7, you have the equality that the Lord Jesus had with the Godhead. And then when we come down to verses 9 through 11, we have his exaltation. His exaltation. Verses 5 through 8 gives us 7 steps down, his perfect humility of the Lord Jesus. And 9 through 11 gives us 7 steps up, his perfect exaltation. He has been shown in humility, hasn't he? He has been humble. And there is a day he has been exalted. Wherefore, in verse 9, wherefore God also highly exalted him. One day that's going to be seen, that's going to be shown, his exaltation. So let's look back now to Judges and chapter 8. Judges chapter 8. And verse 1. Judges chapter 8 and verse 1. And the men of Ephraim said to Gideon, why hast thou served us thus, that thou calledst us not, when thou wentest to fight with the Midianites? And they did chide with him sharply. Now here's Gideon's response. And he said unto them, what have I done now in comparison of you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God hath delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison of you? Then their anger was abated toward him when he had said that. So here we have another event in Gideon's life that tells us something about the man. Here's Gideon's dilemma. He's gone out and perhaps some of the battles will be gone over in other nights, but he's won a great victory, hasn't he? And so when you see a victory, you think everybody's going to be happy, don't you? Don't you think everybody's going to be happy? When you see something done in the assembly or something done, isn't everybody going to be happy? Ephraim wasn't happy. And I'm not pointing fingers, and you know that, and I don't have anybody in mind, you know that too. But sometimes people are just not happy no matter what happens. And here's Ephraim, and they gloss over the victory. They gloss over what Gideon did and all that he had gone through, and they just focus on this one little point. You know what the point is? You left us out, and you hurt our feelings. You left us out. You didn't call us. And so here is Gideon. You know, sometimes these things surprise us, don't they? And it surprises me sometimes, anyway. You'll be mentioning something to somebody, and right away they come up with the problem. What? I thought this was a good thing. But here's the problem with it. Where sometimes, well, in my job, I'm an inspector, okay? Honest confession. I'm an inspector. And in my line of work, I have to inspect things. So if you had given somebody a blueprint for this platform, all right, and then you said, okay, Paul, you come and inspect it. Well, I'd take some measurements and I'd see, well, how's the paint? And I have to be critical, right? I have to criticize the thing. My line of inspection was welding inspection. And so one of the guys at the shop I used to work at, he says, "You're a welding critic." You know what I had to say? You're right, I am. I can't ever remember ever saying, "Good job," right? But I can remember many times saying, "Well, you didn't do this right, you didn't do that right," and marking things up. So I learned something that day, that you don't have to just find fault with everything. If there's things that are right, you can say, "Good job. I appreciate that. That looks like a nice well. You did a good job on this thing." There's nothing wrong with that. You're not hindering a thing. And what you're doing is you're getting people on your side, really. So here he is, and Gideon has come from this victory, and the men chided with him sharply. There's a couple of ways to respond, isn't there? You know, I was never good at boxing. You know what happens in the boxing ring? Well, the two fellows spar off, and before long, one guy gets punched in the nose. Well, if you lose your temper, you've lost the fight, right? If you lose your temper, you've lost the fight. And so I was never good at it, because every time I got punched in the nose, I lose my temper. And that was the end of the fight. So Gideon could have responded, and we're going to just touch on chapter 12 in a minute, but Gideon could have responded with all kinds of things, right? Could have thrown all kinds of accusations back at these Ephraimites. He had the right to do it. He was the victor. He could have done that, but he didn't. You see, and this is why I want to bring out the idea of esteeming others better than yourself. We're going to look at that in just a minute too. He says, "What have I done now in comparison of you?" He takes the low place. We've already seen that he's marked by humility. Can we be marked by humility? Can we afford for someone to make a false accusation against us? Can we afford that? I think we can. I think we can be big enough in ourselves to be able to take someone, if someone says something about you, just to be able to say, "Okay, where's this coming from? Why is this person upset?" And instead of lashing back, it's so easy, isn't it? It's so easy just to have those things that maybe it's not your problem, but they're just on the tip of your tongue, aren't they? Just to lash back. Here he says, "What have I done in comparison to you?" He says, what does he say? The gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim. Just what you pick up around the corners of the field or of the vineyard in Ephraim. He says, that's better than what we've spent all the time in the vintage of Abiezer. He says, he said, "God hath delivered into your hands the princes." Did he? I thought he delivered into the hands of Gideon. But Gideon says, "They're yours. Yes, I want a great victory. You can have it." And so he just gives it over to him. And it says then that then their anger was abated when he said that. He diffused the situation. How often situations escalate, right? He said that, she said that, and up it goes and up. And before long, there's a big problem, isn't there? Now, if you go over to chapter 12, just look at chapter 12 just for a second. We're not going to stay there. We're just going to look at verse 1. "The men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and went northward and said unto Jephthah." Jephthah's not Gideon. All right? Jephthah's not Gideon. And they didn't know that. "Wherefore passest thou over to fight against the children of Ammon, and didst not call us to go with thee? We will burn thine house with thee with fire." Jephthah said unto them, "I and my people are at great strife with the children of Ammon. And when I called you, you delivered me not out of their hands. And when you saw that deliver not, I put my life in my hands and passed over," and so on. And then verse 4, "And Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim. And the men of Gilead smote Ephraim, because they had said, "You Gileadites are fugitives," and so on. Different outcome this time, isn't it? Jephthah's not Gideon. And so he punishes the men of Ephraim for what they did. But back to chapter 8, and picking up with the thought from Philippians chapter 2, esteem others better than themselves. How do we do that? How do we esteem others better than ourselves? Gideon says, "What are we?" And look at you. He emphasizes the things that he can about them and what he appreciates about them. We were in Bible reading quite a long time ago, and we were in Philippians chapter 2, and one brother said, how can I esteem or think someone's better than me if I don't think they're better than me? That's a good question, isn't it? How can I think someone's better than me if I don't think they're better than me? But you see, he was missing the point. To esteem others better than themselves, it doesn't say that this fellow is better than this fellow, or this lady is better than that lady. What it means is not worth. It's not that someone is worth more, but it's the welfare, okay? Do I put others' welfare before my own? Am I willing to make sacrifices that others might benefit from? Am I willing to, and we were doing it tonight, am I willing to spend time praying for others? Am I willing to spend time doing things for other people, esteeming others better than themselves? And really, when it came to Philippi, if these two sisters, if they would really just have practiced that, perhaps there wouldn't have been a problem in the assembly. Perhaps. So, the idea with esteeming is the other person's welfare and not their worth. And so that's two events, two accounts of events in Gideon's life. First of all, in chapter 6, we saw the adverse conditions and his sacrifice that he made. And then we learned from Judges chapter 8 the truth of esteeming others better than themselves.